Hello and welcome back to the history of Western music. So last week we finished up with the Renaissance. This week we're going to be taking a look at the Baroque period. Here's just an introductory history to the Baroque period, the Bizarre period. Let's begin. So the Baroque era runs roughly for 150 years, from 1600 to 1750. The original French meaning of Baroque, it actually comes from Portuguese, meaning a pearl-shaped, which is abnormal. Okay, and so in French, Baroque translates to abnormal, bizarre, or even grotesque. Now, we're talking about the influences of the Baroque period. So in the 19th century, we get lots of flamboyant, theatrical, expressive tendencies that derived from the Baroque era. So remember, the 19th century is the 1800s. The 17th century is the 1600s, the beginning of the Baroque era. And we're talking about its influences as well on the 20th century, so the 1900s. And many of the styles of Baroque music were picked up by music historians and composers in the last century. There's many different types of styles. Let's talk about them together. So here's just a timeline of some of the musical and historical events that have happened. Some historical events that are quite important to this time period is the fact that George II rules England. Okay, Shakespeare lives and dies during this time. Unfortunately, he passes away in 1616. But a lot of Shakespeare's plays are derived from that idea of the Renaissance, right? The rebirth from that classical period of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And because of that, a lot of the music takes the same kind of tone as a lot of Shakespeare's plays because they are based in that Renaissance rebirth idealism. Now, the 17th century is really big and important for things like science, politics, religion, and warfare. We get the scientific revolution, which relies on the many concepts of mathematics, observations, practical experiments, and we get a lot of very famous astronomers and scientists coming out of this period, like Kepler and Galileo and Descartes and Isaac Newton. Everybody's studying the stars for the most part. We get a lot of different things going on in terms of politics, religion, and war. There's this idea ranged from advocacy for democracy in England to absolute monarchy in France. Remember, democracy in England, this would be very new because it was ruled by kings. And then we get this kind of shift in France to an absolute rule by kings or the monarchy. There's also religious conflicts that occur during this time. We get the 30 Years' War, which lasted, as you guessed it, boom, 30 years, where you have German Protestants and Catholics duking it out all across Europe at this time. We also get the English Civil War, which lasted not as long, only 7 years, but this is between King Charles and Parliament. Charles the First wanted to keep power, but Parliament said, actually, you know what? We are elected officials. Sure, we are very wealthy and of the upper class, but we don't want the king to have all the power. Okay? And so there's lots of conflicts that are going on at this time. We also get the major driving force of expansion in terms of colonialism during this time period. The 17th century is huge for that, as well as the 18th century, but the 17th century, the 1600s, is where it's at in terms of colonialism. This allowed Europeans to expand quite significantly overseas. British, French, and Dutch colonies in North America, Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. Okay, these three main countries, okay, were the primary stakeholders in terms of colonies throughout the world. Germany had quite a few as well, but mainly stuck in Africa. You get lots of really interesting things happening with importing of goods and trading of goods. Sugar and tobacco become the main imports into Europe from around the world. Okay, and this then brought with it this idea of the intensive slave labor brought from West Africa. European traditions also brought to the Western Hemisphere. Okay, as travelers moved across the Atlantic and into North and South America, that they brought with them religion, okay, as well as music, especially the church hymns that missionaries brought over with them from Europe into the Americas, into the Western Hemisphere. Capitalism, though, became supreme. Britain and the Netherlands, as well as northern Italy, prospered significantly during this time. Everybody had kind of their hands in all these different pots. And the idea of the stock company became really well known. And Hamburg in Germany, as well as London in England, there were these stock companies. So companies where very wealthy people could just put money in, and then you'd have a few people who would decide as to what happens to that money. And many of these pools of money actually went to financing, building, operating, and funding opera houses at this time. And as we will see, the Baroque period is truly one of the most important time periods for opera. It's when opera began, its kind of namesake in the sense. Public music and public concerts were huge here, and this also drove capitalism. People were paying to see musicians play. You didn't have to be of the upper echelon. You didn't have to be that wealthy, but you did have to pay in order to listen to these. And it's very similar to today's sense, where we pay to go and listen to musicians sing and play. Now, the patronage for the arts were huge at this time. There were many different people all over who wanted music, who wanted art, who really looked at architecture as being huge as well. Now, musicians of this time, of the Baroque period, really depended on the patronage of the courts. Okay, so from the royalty, the monarchies, having musicians from all over the Europe, not all over the world, but all over Europe, come and play in their courts. In churches, there were some very famed musicians who were sought after by specific churches, such as the Sistine Chapel Choir in Vatican City, in Rome. Now, in Italy, musicians were best off. This is where you wanted to be as a musician. In France, under King Louis XIV, okay, he really was this absolute monarch. He took power and wealth and he concentrated it only within himself and his family and a select few of people around him. He controlled the arts, including the music in France. France, under Louis XIV, replaced Spain as the predominant power in Europe. And then, because France replaced Spain as this predominant power, the music of France then disseminated throughout the entirety of Europe. We get academies where private associations could sponsor musicians to play, to learn, to teach. As well, we get the public opera houses, the first one opening in Venice in 1637. And we get tickets and subscriptions to operas and to musical performances that started in England in 1672. Now, Baroque art and culture really influenced the music around. As you can see in the background, we have the St. Peter's Basilica, where the Pope lives, in Vatican City, which is in the heart of Rome. This time was a period of change, adventure, and discovery. In art, we get a lot of vibrant, elaborate decorations. This idea of grandeur is huge, and the idea of love of the dramatic. People in this time period throughout Europe loved the drama, the theater of it all. They loved taking these ancient stories from the Renaissance period, from Greece and from Rome, and then pushing them through into this drama where there's always good and evil and love and conquer all things. Sculpture emphasized motion and change, much like the idea of humanism in the Renaissance period. Architecture was still built on the classical ancient model from the Renaissance. As you can see in this photo, right? This is the St. Peter's Basilica, where the Pope gives Mass every Sunday. And you can actually see these the colonnade here. Okay, these are the columns and the capitals that were taken from that idea of Greece and Rome. And then music. We come to music and how it has evolved. It is centered on opera. There's this new intensity that conveys emotion. Okay, remember the dramatic action, the drama of it all is very important in music. So we get a lot of contrasts in the music of the Baroque period. As well, the concept of the public emerged. Before this period, in the Renaissance, music was very private. And only those who were at the king's courts or the monarchy courts or who had money could listen to music. Whereas the everyday person, music was not available to them. But now the idea of the public music, if you could pay a small fee, you are more than welcome to join us in listening to this music. It's pretty interesting. So some characteristics of music in the Baroque period. Like we said, it's all about the drama, and so the music acts on emotions and moves the listener. There are many trends coming from Italy in this music. There are many flexible and regular rhythms, right? In terms of flexible rhythms, we get vocal lines that are very similar to jazz, where you have a lot of improvisation and not a lot that is actually written down. The musicians would know the notes that they were supposed to sing, and then they would improvise or vocal improvise or solo around those specific notes. Now, we get a lot of regular rhythms because it is very difficult to dance to irregular rhythms. And so the dance rhythms are very regular and on the beat, not a whole lot of syncopation. And so people could dance very easily to this music. In terms of notation and the writing of music, bar lines became very common. And by the end of the century, you have bar lines that were used actually to mark off different measures of music. And the texture of the music itself, that color, the texture, how we perceive the music as listeners, is homophonic in nature. Homo meaning one, phonic meaning sound, so one sound in nature. And so we get this texture, a very firm bass, right? Boom, 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 and some very floral treble above that. So we have the bass, boom, 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 and the treble above it. And it's very homophonic, one and the other. Okay, one sound per thing. Harmony. Now, chords and dissonance became huge during the Baroque period. The idea of playing chords, people singing together in different notes to come to these very nice harmonious chords, were really well used at this time. Dissonance, where you have the chord structure kind of falling apart and getting away from each other a little bit, and then eventually coming back together in a proper chord, is also found. So dissonance is also found where you get notes that are sung or that are played that don't quite fit in the chord, give the listener a sense of unease or unfinished music, and then eventually it resolves. Chromaticism, so if you take a look on the piano, right, going from the white key, hitting every single white key and subsequent black key all along the piano keyboard, we call this the chromatic structure of a piano, was really used in terms of the solo vocalization, improvisation style. Tone, okay, it also evolved gradually. As instrument technology evolved, so did the tonality of the music. There's this idea of the figured bass, where you have musical notation that shorthands indicated chords, so that if you're improvising, okay, you know the chords, you know what notes fit within that chord, and typically musicians didn't play anything outside of those chords unless if they threw a sneaky bugger of a note in there to create dissonance. And we get this idea of the basso continuo, the continuous bass line. Right, where the instrumentalist, there was an accompaniment part in the background that would provide this continuous line of music so that the more experienced, let's say, or the more virtuoso musician could solo and improvise above that, basso continuo, that background accompaniment bass line. there was this shift from polyphony to homophony, right? Remember, polyphony is, right, poly, meaning many, phony, sounds or voices, and we have homophony, homo, meaning one, phony, again, is one sound or one voice. Okay, there's a shift. And in this shift, we get this new style that comes out of Florence, the Florentine Camerata. Okay, where it came from the artistic humanists at this time, the aristocratic humanists at this time, very wealthy people who love the idea of the human form and the ideals of the past, humanism, to bring them forth. And so this, in turn, evolved into a new style of music. We also get new harmonic structures. So this idea of functional harmony, why are we doing it in the first place? Moving from one chord to the next, which helps shape the musical line. Going from major chords to minor chords, back to major chords, typically to end the piece, helps shape the music, the structure of the music in terms of its harmony. So this style, what is it all about? The Camerata style, all the way from Florence, Italy. Well, it approaches this idea of drama through music. The Camerata style is very expressive in terms of emotions. And so those early dramaticists and operatic musicians took this idea of the expressive style of Camerata and took it and really ran with it in terms of creating and writing, composing, and expressing these operas to the public. Melody is very expressive, right? Lots of high notes, lots of very virtuous sounds, virtuous flowing music within these operatic or cameratic styles. There's very driving rhythms, keeping things moving, keeping your listeners and audience always engaged. We get some dissonant chords that then resolve. So it goes from minor to major with these weird odd notes thrown in there to create color, to create dissonance, to create heartache, and then color and resolve when the chord finally comes together without those weird added notes. The idea of the forte piano, these echo effects, dum, bum, 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 very similar to bells ringing, right? We get this. This is very dramatic in operatic style. Bum, 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 bim, bum, bim, bum. Where there's a strong attack, and then the music dies away, but it's still heard. And then another attack, and slowly it moves along in a bell-like fashion, this forte piano fashion. And the idea of dynamics, louds and softs, both add to this effect of expressive style, especially in opera when you mix music and acting. And essentially storytelling together. Like I said before, we get this rise of the virtuoso musician, the musician who could solo, who could really belt it out with only knowing the notes of specific chords. There's a lot happening in terms of instrumental music in the Baroque period. We get a lot of refinement in the actual design and build of instruments in both Italy and Germany. Vocal techniques evolved as well. We've mentioned the idea of the castrato or castrati, which is the plural. Okay, where you have these male singers who were castrated at boyhood so that their voices, the vocal range of their voices doesn't shift. Okay, the key of their voice doesn't shift. And so that they can sing a wide variety of notes without hitting puberty. Because once you hit puberty, your voice actually, right, it shifts with the hormonal change. And the key in which you sing in shifts. The voice in which you sing in actually shifts, and it usually goes lower. But these castrato, these castrated male singers, were soprano and alto, the soprano and alto registers, so the higher registers that males typically don't sing in, were preserved. And it gives these young musicians, these castratos, okay, this incredible breath support, breath control, And they were able to get into the very high registers and into the kind of the mid to low range of register as well. Very heroic in terms of going from these highs to lows to highs to lows. Now, women in this period, during the Baroque period, expanded their roles in the music scene as well. There were women had careers as professional singers and composers of opera, right? We've all heard that phrase, it's not over until the fat lady sings. Why don't we say till the fat man sings? Because at this time when opera started, women were the main figures in opera. They were the most professional career holders in opera. And a couple of very famous ones are Francesca Caccini and Barbara Strozzi. In the photo here we have Francesca Caccini. Okay, and she is the first woman to ever write an opera. It's really, really something special to really think about. Now, this is an all-European art form. Okay? We get these ideas of faraway lands. You have to remember, Shakespeare lived during this time, and so he's writing in a time where his plays take place in faraway lands with creatures and mythological things. If for one comes to mind is A Midsummer's Night Dream, where you have fairies. We get this idea of eroticism in opera, right? The faraway lands, costumes from worlds beyond Europe, from Asia, from the New World. Everything was exchanged between all of these musicians and different opera houses, the early opera houses, right? You get this idea of internationalization of opera and music. In Italy, we have these ideas in music that are sensuous in terms of the melodic forms. These very very sensuous, melodic, operatic forms. In France, you have these precise dance rhythms, right? Remember, King Louis XIV, right? His courts were all about dancing, and so you get these very precise dance rhythms. A little bit of syncopation, not much, but lots of on-the-beat stuff. In Germany, you've got this idea of polyphony. Many, many voices, many sounds coming together, especially in the church music. And from England, we get choral song, madrigals. These small forms of musical ensembles that really give life to the music itself, to the culture itself. And so all of these different musical styles, all these different musical cultures are coming together, in particular in Italy, and later on into Germany, England, and France, for the beginnings of opera. This was the quintessential art form of the 17th century. It is the combination, the union between poetry, drama, music, and stagecraft. The texts, which are the booklets, which we call librettos, small books, come in rhymed or unrhymed verses. Continuous music is found throughout. Lots of costumes. Lots of attempts to recreate Greek tragedies. Antigone comes to mind. There's this blend of existing genres. We get the plays of Shakespeare coming together with the theatrical spectacles, included with dance and music. There's a strong emotion in this type of art form. We call it the hyper-reality. What is not actually real, but is what is perceived as to be the best reality possible. Something so out there that people want to pay to see it. And here we have a photo of one of the most famed opera houses in Italy itself, where you can see the background of the stage here is very elaborate with, remember, the columns and the colonnades, the architecture from the past, from the ancient world, and we have the actors down below. That's it for today, folks. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful week ahead. Don't forget, this presentation can be found on our Google Classroom. If you want to take a deeper look into the slides, you're more than welcome to. Also, don't forget to answer the discussion question for this week. Have an awesome week ahead, And if you have any questions, feel free to email me anytime. Adios for now.